Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 32 of Are We There Yet? With our guest, Andrew Daniel. And this episode is called Elastic Heart. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Susan Ruth.
And I'm your host, Mara Adelman. And today we are three people who are going to have the conversation and raise all those questions we have about where is the there when it comes to dating, relationships, and sex.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Andrew, I learned about you through my dear friend Hannah Bethel months ago when you two started dating. And I had you on Hey Human podcast. I had such a delightful time. And I felt like we barely scratched the surface. And when you started talking about somatic work, I thought, ooh, that sounds something that is perfect for Are We There Yet? So here you are.
Here I am. Thank you for having me. Round two.
Yay. And we 2 weeks ago scratched the surface a little bit to prepare our listeners or viewers as to what it means, what the thing that somatic is. But I think you are probably best to explain it. So if you would talk about what that is and what your work entails.
So the work that I do is called Cinesomatics. And basically we use video and movement to help people see the unconscious patterns that run their life. And so somatics is a general term for body-oriented work.
Okay. And okay, that's great. And how does that incorporate with relationships and sex? Because that's also a part of what you do.
Yeah, so it's a lot of it. I'll start off with one of the things that we explore is intimacy and what intimacy really is, right? Intimacy is not just sex, it's so much more. And we also look at sexual polarity, right? The interaction and balance and polarity and dynamics between masculine and feminine, men and women. And all of that stuff shows up in the body. There's literally ways that the feminine comes through and the masculine comes through in everybody's body. How we approach each other, how we approach ourselves, the way we relate to ourselves, the way we relate to sex, the way we relate to our partners. The whole thing gets revealed through the way that we show up in our body. And it can also be healed through that way as well.
Interesting. How did you come into this work?
My own journey of being absolutely abysmal in relationships and sex. And I had a very difficult social life as a child. I had warts on my fingers when I was really young, and so I was bullied and teased a lot for that. And that set up this pretty much 15, 20 years of low self-esteem. I was socially awkward. I didn't really know how to talk to women or girls. And when I did, I screwed it up. And I went on this whole long journey of actually learning about social dynamics, sexuality, how to satisfy a woman, how to become a better man. And that journey led me to developing a course in a concept I called holistic sex. And that was part of my journey of reconciling the spiritual, the more awakened aspects of ourselves with the more primal, sexual, sultry aspects of ourselves, and discovering and also figuring out how could those two come together? How could we have a very wholesome or spiritual or very conscious way to do something that in our culture is traditionally looked at as very maybe dirty or primal or animalistic? How could we actually unite those two? And through that journey, how can we also unite men and women, or the masculine and feminine archetypes in ourselves and each other? Because not only was there war against the religion and spirituality to the sex, the puritanical stuff, but there was also this battle of the sexes. And so through this whole journey, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, we're supposed to be, like, we literally want to be in love with each other. Why is there this battle? Why is there this war? And then in the deeper work that I've done, in the healing work, I realized a lot of that comes from our own internal conflicts, our own judgments, rejections, dissociations, traumas between these masculine and feminine aspects in ourselves. It gets projected into our relationships and into the world.
What's a good example of that? I'm hearing it, but I feel like I'm not.
Yeah. So for example, very, very superficial. We can look at, generally, our society would consider women to be more in touch with their emotions, much more intuitive and feeling. All right. Well, if a man is out of relationship with being able to feel and his emotions, which is huge, which our society tells men, stop feeling, stop crying, suck it up, just get to it. Well, then he's going to be unable to access and relate to women through that way. And then vice versa and all other variations.
Reason my last relationship didn't work out. Exactly. Yes. Okay. That makes, so I see what you're saying. Yeah, it does. Yeah. It plays into that whole thing. Huh.
When we have a society, and I think, in fact, when I use the word society, I could say worldwide, because I think this is a worldwide issue, that we now do not understand how to communicate with each other in a vulnerable way or an intuitive way and an empathic way. And it's causing a lot of issues. We have the term incel. We have, in Japan, there are cuddle camps and, things like that, where people are being trained how to even go so far as to hold hands, or that they're so deprived of an understanding of how to facilitate human touch that they go to these clubs in order to experience any kind of connection like that. Or the shadow side of that is girls being kidnapped from villages and, gang raped until they die, things like that, because they're, because of how women are perceived. So knowing that all those things are going on in the world, was this a progression to lead to this more shadow place, or has this been that way all along, do you think?
Oh gosh, now we're yeah. So there's historically okay, so we can actually go way back. If we want to look at religions and tribes in the early part of the world, originally we had this. It was the hunter-gatherer kind of cultures. So the religions and the spiritual ideas were based on these more primal hunter-gatherer. You kill, you sacrifice. The blood of the buffalo then brings new buffalo into the world. This sort of primitive mythology. Then as we got into the agricultural era of civilization, we saw that the shift from that animal hunter, more masculine, physical, killing to live mythologies switched into more of the Mother Earth mythologies. Gaia, all right, plants come from the earth. That's what gives us life. And so there was also a switch into more of a matriarchal kind of way. Not everywhere, but mythologically it was more about the mother. And so throughout history, then what eventually happened is that you had that same hunter kind of energy turn into warring tribes. These very powerful, masculine, dominated myths and cultures would come in, and you have a very peaceful agricultural Mother Earth culture that now you have warriors come in and they just slaughter them and take over. And so there's been these fluxes and dynamics over time throughout history based off of food and mythology. And so what we have seen is that historically in modern times, and probably in the last at least millennia, this orientation to a masculine dominated society. And I don't mean men dominated society, I mean masculine, which basically means that logic, reason, linear, strength, domineering, these have been a more valued way of seeing the world. And so so here's where this all ties in together, is that is not only a men versus women kind of thing. That is happening within our psyche. And so there's this orientation in the West. You see it in business, right? When women come into, again, stereotypes here, women come into business, they have to be more masculine like the men to fit in and to do all of that stuff. So if we just look at these stereotypes, we see that our culture in general has oriented itself to value more of these yang masculine qualities. And so what happens is that the feminine qualities, again, not women, but the feminine qualities turn into shadow material. They're rejected, they're avoided. And so that's things like surrendering, feeling, intuition, empathy,
vulnerability, again, being vulnerable about things.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Opening up all of those seemingly less valuable to a programmer, engineer way of seeing the world. And so that relationship within ourselves starts to have an effect on the way we see the world. So this brings us to the question, the real question of how this is happening in society and what does this have to do with sex and everything. Well, when you have a culture and you have a person, you have yourself that is out of relationship with these particular things, you're going to be out of relationship with those things when you have a relationship, or the gender or person that is reflecting those things. And so you get to see a society that does not necessarily value those things. And so you have people that are afraid of being vulnerable, surrendering is bad, penetrating is more valuable than being penetrated. You have this sort of mindset. And what happens is it's very imbalanced, and you get a lot of frustration. You got a lot of pain, you get a lot of suffering, because when you're avoiding and rejecting these qualities, that cycle, that yin and yang, that masculine and feminine connection doesn't happen at a deep level. You have to have both people willing to penetrate and be penetrated in order for that to happen. You have to have both people willing to be vulnerable to allow intimacy to even occur. So there's all of these sort of dynamics. Big picture answer for that question.
That was well done. And it reminded me of something. So Esther Perel would always talk about how, like, yeah, once upon a time, we all got married, and you just got married, and it was the husband and the wife dynamic. But now we kind of expect everybody to be our best friend and our lover, and fill so many more of those buckets. But what you're explaining with the shadow work is, if you're out of relationship with yourself, then you can't be in relation with others. And we're all out of relationship with ourselves in a lot of ways, and not being vulnerable or being allowed to let people penetrate us. So it's all kind of not matching where it needs to match.
Yeah, and it starts within ourselves. And of course, we adopt a lot of it growing up from our culture and our parents and all that stuff.
And in that, it sounds like to me, and I might be paraphrasing, but that in that inability to touch that other part of ourselves, it's almost like people double down on the other. Yeah. So if I don't know how to be penetrated, if my understanding of the world is to penetrate, I double down on that, and then it creates violence.
Yeah. Well, if all you know how to do is penetrate, and there is no relationship to being penetrated and surrendering, there's a certain if that libido that then turns into aggression is then funneled through penetration, you get like this annihilating, destructive energy that comes through.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
intimacy at all.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you reverse it, right, the feminine, the surrendering, you get you get, if the surrendering goes too much, you become a doormat. You become an abusee. You become codependent, and that doesn't work either.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Do you primarily have couples coming to you or single people, or is it all over the place?
All over. Right now, I have a lot of individual people that come in. Sex isn't the primary thing we focus on, but it, of course, comes up. It's connected to everything. And some people come in and they have that sexual energy turned on, right? You can feel them. They're juicy. They're alive. There's a sensuality that moves through their body. And other people are closed and frozen and shut off and numbed. And it's not just about having orgasms and sex. That's the life force. That's our creative and invigorating libido to actualize ourselves in the world. And so having sex and all of that come up is a part of that healing process. Now, couples come in, and that's a whole different dynamic.
If people are already in a place where vulnerability is complicated for them, what are some of the tools you use to help break through that boundary so that you can bring them into the light?
So, do you have an example?
Sure. Let's say there's a couple where they're frustrated because they haven't been intimate for a long time. And let's just use a heteronormative as an example. The female says, oh, well, he just sits around with his buddies and watches sports and drinks beer and, he doesn't want to have sex. And he complains, oh, well, she's frigid and she's this, you know what I mean? That kind
Sure,
of
yeah.
general stereotypical honeymooners type situation.
Yeah, so I think even before we get into that, I think it's a good idea to describe intimacy. Now, when you said intimacy, most people think sex. And sex is a really high form of intimacy. But there's a lot of people that have sex with no intimacy. That's a lot of porn, right?
A lot of people do the opposite. They have.
Well, you don't even have to be pornographic. I think a lot of people check out of their bodies completely during sex.
Yeah. And what you said as well is that people are having intimacy without sex. And so intimacy in this work is basically letting people see into you and you having a willingness to see into other people. So it's not just one direction, it's bi-directional. It's penetrating and being penetrated.
Wow.
And so sometimes it can occur at different levels, right? So you can imagine a man physically penetrating a woman, which is amazing for both, while the man lets himself emotionally be penetrated in the heart from the woman. And that's often a very typical, archetypical dynamic that happens. And it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing. So then the question is, if everybody, we can assume, and let's assume, and if this is not the case, then there's much bigger issues we have to deal with. But let's assume most people, if not everyone, crave real intimacy and connection and love. Even if they don't know it or express it, like it's built in. And so then the question is why? Why do we avoid that? Why do we deny it? Why are we scared of it? Well, it's because of vulnerability. Intimacy demands vulnerability, and that requires us to open up and to be open to being hurt, to being open to being rejected, to being open to being let down, whatever it is. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but we have to be open to it. Because if we're open to that, we also are open to being loved, to being seen and heard and felt and all this stuff. So when a couple would come in like that, generally we try to get to the bottom of why they are avoiding each other. What is it within themselves that they're avoiding? And then so diving into that avoidance, we usually see what the fear is. Why are you unwilling to be vulnerable? Then we discover resentment, judgments, fears, traumas, all that stuff.
How much of that correlates? Oh, sorry, Susan. We had just done an episode and we talked about the ACEs score, acute childhood trauma scores. How much of that do you feel like comes from people's like past trauma, childhood?
A lot of it.
Like 80%? I would say like 80. My
I
guess would be
mean,
like 80% comes from all of that, but I'm just guessing a number.
yeah, a number. I'm not quite sure. It sounds very cliche, but our childhood really affects us. And in the somatic work I do, what's really interesting is that the way that a person is showing up in their body is often modeled from the parents. They sort of through osmosis learn the feminine aspects and their masculine aspects from their mother and father, or whoever those two primary caregivers are. And so when I have couples or people come in and I actually see them moving in their body, I have a really high probability of being able to discover their parents' relationship dynamic in just the way that they move their body, because they've taken on that masculine feminine parental dynamic. It's now in them, and as they move through the world, that's the reference point. That's how they see the masculine and feminine showing up, which is why you often see children having similar gestures and mannerisms as their parents, and then also attracting mates that reflect their parents.
My friend the other day was like, oh yeah, once I understood that, I'm realizing that my boyfriend looks so much like my father. The way people act and the way they look,
Yeah.
and the mannerisms and the avoidance and the anxious.
Well, there's a theory, of course, that our relationships, as we begin, at least, that we seek out the parent that we got the least amount of comfort, love, and support, as to heal that initial childhood wound, and then it moves on from there. So a lot of people choose the same person that is actually patterned after the more dysfunctional parental unit.
Called the imago theory. Do I have that right, Andrew? The imago, where like you're trying to be with somebody who reminds me of all your childhood things so that you can fix all of those things moving forward. I think it's imago theory. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
So yeah, a lot of childhood stuff.
Yeah.
It's not always, but usually you trace it back to parents. Parents, I would say, probably be the number one thing that I see. Your relationship with your parents' relationships. That's most of it. And then from there, you have other stuff, things that happen. But most people never just, people just don't get traumas from nowhere in their life, and most of this stuff, when we're so young, we don't know how to discern. We don't know, we just absorb all of it. So
It's all from cable news. Hey, if you have, is there a specific model that is modeled after heteronormative, or does it matter? It's non-gender bias, non-sexual orientation bias. It's just really anyone, because you're dealing with the masculine and feminine within each individual. Is that correct?
Correct. However, there are these archetypes of masculine and feminine. So it's really important that those are clear. If you think the feminine principle is penetrative and the masculine principle is receptive, you're going to have a lot of confusion and a lot of problems. Now, man, woman doesn't really matter. We have a norm, but the thing that is important is understanding what these principles are, and most importantly, I think, in our society, is to let go of all the judgments of them. Because you can just imagine that when someone hears surrendering and submissive and receptive, there's probably judgments and trauma around that, versus a society that's saying leading and dominant. And then, well, there's some judgments around that, because a dominant energy, a lot of times we see a domineering energy, which is different than being dominant, or a tyrannical, oppressive energy versus a leading energy. And so there's a lot of these distortions. The labels get messed up. We change the names of things. Things blur together. And so it really creates a lot of confusion. And we're seeing a lot of confusion in the world right now about some of these very things. And if we can start having accurate definitions, like the words are really important, because those words translates to internal symbolic representations. If if you thought your whole life sad was happy and happy was sad, you're going to be really confused in life. And so it's the same thing with this, is that these principles within us. And if we're at war with them in ourselves, if we're judging them in ourselves, you look at the world of many, many people that hate themselves, hate their bodies, hate how they were born. And so they're out of relationship with these very things. So I think, firstly, letting go of these judgments and getting accurate understandings of what these are without one is better or worse than the other. They are equal but different. And that's just how it has to be. North Pole and South Pole are the exact same thing. They're just the opposites. And so if we can start healing those wounds around all of that, we're going to have major healing and progress.
What's something that you can recommend for folks who maybe don't feel quite ready to, be videoed watching them move and things like that, but they can just incorporate some stuff for themselves and in the relationship or even on their own, because we all know everything starts with ourselves. What would be a good advice there, or a good exercise, if you will?
The first thing that comes to my mind is about our needs. Most of us aren't getting our needs met. Most of us grew up not having our needs met. You wouldn't believe how many clients come in and it's just like their mother and father were narcissistic. They abandoned them. They ignored them. They were manipulated, all of this stuff. So figuring out what our needs are, you can write them down. What needs are being met, what needs are not being met, and starting to cultivate the ability to ask for those needs to be met, and then doing the same for your partner. They could do the exercise themselves, or you could do it together, or whatever it is, or you could just ask this in normal conversations. And I do that. I say, what are your needs? What do you need? Tell me. I want to meet them. Do you not feel safe? Do you need to be heard? What is happening here? Do you need to be held? Do you need me to shut up and just listen to you? Do you need advice? What is it that you need in this moment? All right, well, then in the bedroom, what are the needs here? What are your fantasies? What excites you? What scares you? All right, what feels like something that you really want, but you're terrified of, and so you push it away? Okay, well, intimacy, whatever that is. So start really getting honest with these core fundamental needs and even these sexual needs, and start having a dialogue with your partner about this, which is a great way for the example you gave of that, the wife and the husband. That's a great way to move forward in that. The thing is you have to have both partners that care about each other's needs and their own needs, and to meet them. And if you don't, can't help you. No one can help you until you decide that that's important, that you value that. So that's a real fundamental and easy one, because you just check in. You're like, well, what do I wish my partner was doing for me?
And so much, I'm sure you're aware of the love languages. We did a whole podcast on love languages, and that really breaks it down for people. You can take a quiz and tell you what your needs are. And now if you come back to somebody with your needs, if I take it back to like the last person I dated, I think he cared, but he just wasn't capable of meeting his own needs currently to then be able to meet somebody else's needs currently. And then something you said keeps coming to mind is that I went very masculine and kept trying to penetrate, communicate, right? Which in the scheme of things isn't going to get anybody where they want. Although I just went to dinner with like a bunch of fabulous women that I know, and most of them are having relationship issues, and it all comes down to communication, right? They're not talking about their needs. They're not communicating. The other person isn't communicating. And they're like that couple Susan talked about, where they're totally out of connection and they're not having the intimacy. So to make everybody I talk to, I feel like is not in intimacy, not in connection, and not communicating well.
I would argue that a lot of people, though, go into relationship in order to solve these issues that they're carrying with them through every relationship. So until they can touch that in themselves, and they're out there seeking their other half, which is one of the worst lies ever told anyone, of course.
Twin flame concept. No.
I mean, it's ridiculous to go out there and be like, oh, I'm not a whole person.
Yeah.
Maybe you could fill me up.
Complete me.
It's insane. I mean, not to offend pretty much anyone watching this, but you're never in my mind, at least, it's going to be extremely rare to find the answers outside of oneself, because you're just bringing all of that to every relationship you're in. And a lot of my friends that I've talked with are like, oh, I don't understand, the same thing happens with this guy and this guy and this guy. And I'm like, well, what's the common denominator? You are. Right. What are you doing first? Let's start there and work our way out.
I was just going to say, you said something great. The way I see it is that it's not two halves coming together to create a whole. It's two wholes coming together to create something greater than their sum. So it's a 1 + 1 = 3 rather than a 0.5 equals 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for most of the planet is running around at 0.5 or less, or 0.75. I would say if you're at 0.75 and you meet somebody else who's a 0.75, that's a pretty good chance you might.
But this is why that it's not shocking to me that people grow apart. Of course you have, because you're already starting in a place where you're going to blossom and grow, hopefully, as a human being as you move through your life. And if you're already coming to the table and the table only has half the table settings, you're like, shit, man, I'm hungry and there's not enough food here. I'm going to go, as you would put it, hunter and gather somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's fabulous.
But I would say at 0.75, Susan and I debate this a lot. Like, I like to practice because I feel like you can only get good at relationship by practicing being in relationship. I'm just fine when I'm all by myself. I don't get triggered. Everything's fabulous, right? And then you bring a relationship into it. And to me, that's where the work kind of happens.
But see, I disagree. I would think that even when we're by ourselves, we still have the same the same things happen. They just happen not with a lover or a romantic partner. You get triggered by the guy that's a jerk to you at the grocery store, or you get triggered by your parents on the phone, or your brother.
Those are still relationships.
They're still relationships. What I'm saying is, like, the idea that, oh, when I'm by myself, none of that stuff happens. I would argue that you're probably not like looking deeply at just general relationship that you're moving through the day, because every single person, including the person looking back at us in the mirror when we're naked and we say, oh, I'm so blah, 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 and blah, that's still an interrelational circle,
Yeah, intimacy too, right? It's like, it's not just with other people. Are you willing to look inside yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people aren't. And that's why they can't let other people in to see them. They don't even want to look at their stuff.
What is that thing? Intimacy, into me you see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so people don't want to let people see them. And so they cut that quickly because,
Yeah.
Interesting. It's all, the more I learn about all of this, I'm like, how does anybody figure it out? That's where my brain always goes. And if they figure it out, it's unfortunately most of my friends, they don't figure it out for very long because most people are falling apart. Hi. Read Andrew's book. I have a positive. Hold on. Andrew wrote an amazing book called Awaken to Your True Self. So if we read your book, will it help me feel that there's faith that someday is possible?
It will probably feel like it's annihilating you.
Oh.
Yeah.
But then only to build back up from the ashes? That's okay. I do a lot of that. I annihilate myself and bring myself back up.
Great. Yeah, it's really about being able to penetrate and drop through all of the masks and the personas and the images that we put up, because this is what keeps us from intimacy. So it's called awaken to your true self, not awaken to your best ideal self. And that process is through the process of subtraction, through letting go. And so we have an image of what we feel is going to be lovable, right? There's an image of ourselves that we either are at or we idealize that want to be at, and says, this image, that's lovable. That's enough. This is what people will accept. And then so we abandon who we really are and then try to build this image up in order to be lovable. And then other people do it. And then so you got everybody's personas interfacing out in the world. And then what happens is you get a lot of relationships where it's not two people in love, it's two people's mythologies, it's two people's stories, it's two people's.
Call them your representative.
That's what I call the representative. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. These little avatars I call them a persona or mask. And these things are directly in the way of intimacy. You cannot have intimacy between two masks, between two representatives, two personas. They're not real, A, to begin with, they're projections, and B, they're in between you and each other.
Yeah.
And so stopping and dropping those things rather than adding more is really the path through it. And for a lot of people,
sorry, no. Would people pleasing fall into that category? Something you learn at a young age to people please, but that's just a persona that you're doing because people then like you because you're being a people pleaser? Is that an example of that?
It could be. It feels, in that example, it could be different things. So, for example, it could be, I've had clients that are people pleasers because they're rescuing their parents. Their parents are depressed or alone or immature or whatever. And so they're always trying to make them happy because they love them and they think they're the reason maybe why their parents aren't happy. Or getting a divorce, things like that. And then there's other reasons for people pleasing of never wanting to be rejected, right? You're just terrified of someone rejecting you or being alone. So there's different reasons, I think.
But would that fall into the persona category? Like, do you feel like then you learn that at a young age and now you carry that into your relationships, but you're not really being your true authentic self when you're saying yes to doing things you don't want to be doing? And does that get in the way of intimacy?
Yeah,
but I feel like a lot of females I know are in the people pleasing category. I'm mostly reformed people pleaser. Mostly.
Yeah, it's self-betrayal. You're abandoning yourself, and you abandon yourself in order to get the approval and love of other people. And yeah, that's going to create a distance between them and intimacy, because you have to be willing to not please other people. And that comes to boundaries and your tastes. You say, actually, no, I don't like that. Or no, don't do that. Or this is what I want. It might upset somebody. And so you have to be willing to upset people. It doesn't mean you hurt them on purpose or you're manipulating, but usually people pleasing is a form of manipulation.
It is.
It's actually extraordinary how much manipulation happens in relationships. The whole I'm only jealous because I love you so much. It's like, no, I'm not taking that on. You're jealous because you have shit to work on and you've got some issues there. So that's not my fault by saying, oh, you're making me jealous because, do you know what I mean? It's weird how much people try to put that on other people. I didn't want to forget something that you had said about the mask that I call the representative, you call the mask, that I think there's also in some cases an expectation for other people to maintain their representative and their mask in order for you to be okay in a relationship. And that's also to me a fascinating phenomenon. Like, this person better show up all the time or I'm not interested. You better have if you're talking about like makeup done or your sports car shiny or whatever it is, or your excellent job that pays lots of money, you better keep all those things. And if something goes away, then I'm not interested anymore. And that, I think, is a real thing out there in the world.
Yeah, well, that's not love. That's narcissism.
Of course not. But I think it's what
subjectification.
But it is certainly present in a lot of relationships. And they are saying, I love your representative. Don't you let that representative go home. There better not be a fart or a burp or whatever it is in order for me to love you.
Yeah, well, and I think that's interesting too, that there's an image. And so so with people that do that, they are attached to an image, which is a fantasy. They're not actually able to see the person for who they are. They want to see the image. And that's what they're in love with, which makes it narcissistic when you're in love with an image rather than the real thing.
Or
Amazing we get anywhere.
Yeah, I know, man. When I work with clients, I mean, working with hundreds, thousands of people, it's like, holy shit, how does anything get done? Like, and you know what it is? It's grace. It's grace. I mean, we're all these imperfect, perfect things, all figuring it out. Some of us are further down the path of one thing. Some have riper fruit. Some are just blossoming. We're all the same, figuring it out. And so we afford each other, mostly subconsciously, I think this is mostly unconscious, an enormous amount of grace and compassion. And when we don't do that, that's when you just get like that stuff.
How do you...
Sorry. I'll write it down. I'll remember.
How do you, in your own it's hard when there's three of us, obviously, but how do you, in your own relationship, and I'm sure this was hard one, given that you talked about your past, but when you recognize something in someone else, like, oh, this is for you specifically, for Andrew, realizing, oh, this is a person that's kind of further along or is more vulnerable or open. Is it a sense in your body? Is it an intellectual thing? Is it just, who knows?
It's a feeling.
Yeah, the mystery of it all.
Yeah, so the work that I do is really based in getting into the body and moving from feeling rather than the intellect in the head. Because the intellect in the head is where the fantasies and the images and the suffering and the stories and our addictions, all of that's up there in our head. When we're truly present, when we're truly in our body feeling, again, this comes back to the feminine. The feminine is the yin energy, is the feeling energy, where the yang energy is this thinking. They both have their place. They're both valid. I've just found that the thing that's most aligned with the universe and everything is feeling. So plugging into that feeling, again, feeling is not feelings. So this is another war out there, is the war against emotions. Men, oh, I don't care about your feelings. Oh, facts don't care about your feelings. I don't want to hear about your feelings. Any of this stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. Most people, when they say that, they mean opinions, judgments, they mean being offended, and then sometimes they even mean acting out emotions or being hysterical. That stuff is not really feeling, that's acting out feeling, or actually people when they're hysterical, they're not feeling. There's the feeling, they don't want to feel it, and then they go crazy on it, and it looks like they're being emotional, and those get translated to feelings. What I'm really talking about is that inner sense that instead of analyzing the world, you feel it. It's a direct experience rather than a mental figuring outness.
Feels super feminine. You're right. Just even that concept of like feeling, intuition.
Yeah, and so that's why typically women tend to be more in tune with that. However, men can develop that, as well. And the men that are able to access that intuition and come from that feeling place while still being in the context of their masculinity are just incredible. I mean, it's just when men and women both actualize their masculine and feminine, not neuter both, not become androgynous, you don't know what anything is, but when they actualize both of these and you move through the world from feeling, and then you use the intellect when you need to, but you tap into this vast intelligence that's beyond what we can think, right? Our body has this intelligence that just does its thing. Like if we had to think about all of the stuff that our body does, you just can't. And so what I've also learned is that same intelligence of the body is what connects us to the space and to other people. And so taking it back into the bedroom, when you make love, when you have sex from your head versus having sex from feeling, it is just a world
Yes.
apart.
Yes. And it's very hard sometimes to find that match where it's like both of you are feeling at the same time, and it's all working. But yes, the difference between the feeling sex and the thinking sex are like worlds apart.
Well,
Is that about presence?
Well, here's the thing. Presence requires you to feel. And so oftentimes people that don't want to feel are present because they're trying to check out. They don't want to feel. And what are they not wanting to feel? The fear, the vulnerability, the potential to be loved, the potential to be rejected. I've worked with a lot of clients, and you think that everybody's just afraid of being rejected, that everybody is just, the thing is that they feel like they're not, that they won't be loved. Well, I've found out that's not quite true. It's oftentimes we're terrified of being loved unconditionally in the face of our shadow. Having someone look at us when we feel shame and guilt and pathetic and like all the flaws that we have, and someone staring us in the eyes with unconditional love and loves us anyway. Oh, yeah. Most people are terrified from that. And so then but that's really at the bottom. You have to go a lot of layers to really get to that, not only realization, but access to that feeling place.
Is part of the reason for that because then they might then be expected to be able to unconditionally love that person back to that degree, and they might not be capable to do that?
That could be one. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's an absence of loving oneself too. If I don't even know how to love myself, no, there's no way in hell I'm going to let you love me, because on a deep level, I don't deserve that love and that unconditional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And too, then we don't trust it. It's like, I believe I'm unlovable. Why is this person loving me? There must be something wrong with them.
Totally.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure. So my earlier question was, I want you to give us some hope here. You're so good at doing the kind of the sex, love, and dating through the history pieces and why it's all happening. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you feel like, my sense when I talk to younger people is because they have access to the internet and so much learning and so many books, that they are a little bit further along than my generation at like 49. It took me till 40 to start doing this work. That when I talk to younger people, they know a lot of the things that I'm just been learning in the last 9 years. Do you feel like because there's so much access that we'll get smarter as a society and more intimate and more connected, or are we going to be less so?
It depends what your scale is, what your time frame. I think in the immediate future, things are getting worse before they're getting better.
It feels that way, and it's making.
I think there's a real commodification of sex, and I think for a lot of young people, they're so blithe about it. It's just a thing you do. It feels good, then do it, and they're very disconnected from their feelings because they're so automated at this point with consequences. Yeah.
And then so you have the porn industry that's affected a lot of young men. I mean, to be able to go on here and see unlimited amounts of any kind of naked women or act at age 8, that does something.
We just did a whole episode on porn. It's that at 5 kids are getting access to online porn. It's mortifying.
It rewires their brains up completely. It's awful. It's disastrous.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not one of the kind of people that says the act of having sex on video itself is evil, but what it's doing to society at the scale it is, we got some problems. And then we also have social media, which is also having just a completely disconnecting effect. Young people especially. Even actually, what I've seen that's really interesting is that kind of in the middle of the road, there's an awareness, but the young people are just born into it and they have no fucking clue. And then the older people, they have no idea that it's even dangerous at all. They're just like, oh, I'm on my phone. And then I see this like 80-year-old on his phone out in public. I'm just like, so yeah, I think that with there's a lot of stuff, because then there's also chemicals, right? We have birth control hormones. We have plasticizers, estrogen mimickers. We have some more nefarious agendas. We have the media that portrays just everything completely distorted. So there's a lot of our food. There's a lot of angles in which our sexuality, our sexual identities, our sexual just core fundamental truths and things that have been stable for literally millions of years are just going, as my grandpa would say, tits up.
It's part of that, though. I feel like I hear what you're saying, and part of that I think is a deeper self-understanding on some levels, that one doesn't have to conform with what has been status quo or norm.
Yeah.
I also think young people maneuver through, we talked about this on an episode, sort of they maneuver through all sorts of things, identity, the way, the goth kids did back in the 80s, or you know what I mean? Like every generation has their, what is the thing that bucks up against the system?
Yeah. So the thing with this that I've seen, again, this is from a therapeutic place. This is from actually working with people and seeing, not only seeing this stuff, but actually helping them, like completely changing people's lives. If someone doesn't have let me put it this way. When somebody's reality model is distorted or becomes distorted, a few things happen. One, they become just very disoriented in the world. They lose a vision because you don't know how to get somewhere if you don't know who you are and where you're at. This is why when you're a teenager, a kid, you're like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know. My music changes every year. My clothes changes. My clique changes. How do I know what I'm going to be for the rest of my life? But when there's like core fundamental things that are getting just confused or rewritten, then there's some real problems, because when you have people that don't know any different, so for example, like I said earlier, if you think that the feminine qualities are masculine, masculine qualities are feminine, when you go to do those things in your life and in your relationships, you're going to get what I call reversed results. It's like saying, if you think giving is receiving and receiving is giving, and you go out into the world thinking you're giving to people, what you're actually do is probably taking from people, and you don't realize it. So when these fundamental things get either distorted or flipped, in my clinical practice, what I see is dysfunction. That person 100% of the time struggles in some way in that area of their life. And so what we're seeing in the world is that happening, plus the hijacking of it. Because when you have, children, teenagers that have their identities and associations changing so much, they're very manipulatable. And so just having people that are confused also creates a person who can be manipulated, which is very dangerous, both in society and in relationships. So if you're somebody who's codependent, if you don't know what your needs are, if you don't know what you're doing in your life, how much value you have, how much worth you have, if you're not aware of that, it's going to be really easy for a predator, an abuser, someone to come in and take advantage of that. Which again, all starts with ourselves.
Everything does. Yeah.
So on a positive, sorry. Yeah,
I was just going to say, I think though, when you are growing up and until the day you die, there has to be room for change and for rediscovery and renewal and shadow and light and working with all that stuff. I mean, we never stop.
Yeah.
That.
Yeah.
If you would ask me, what did you want to be when you grew up? I'd list about 20 different things.
Exactly.
So,
and I don't think this maybe would have been one of them.
I probably had no idea at the time. No. Mara,
on a positive note, do you feel like when you work with people, because we had 2 weeks ago talked about somatic practices and how they can help kind of realign people. When you're done with people, do you feel like they're more kind of realigned with who they're supposed to be without all the presentations and the masks and the personas?
Can you clarify? I mean, it's one of those things where it depends on the person.
Totally.
I mean, it's not like a one session thing. You know, if you come
Totally.
in with you have a life of trauma,
Yeah.
Everyone's screwed.
You do one session and you're all better. So, but throughout working with people, I'm assuming you felt like you've had some success with the kind of
tremendous.
Yeah. And so multiple sessions with people. Do you feel like any kind of somatic work, because we had talked about somatic work a couple of weeks ago, I feel like based on what I've learned about it, that's the biggest problem that I see in my medical patients who are not connected to their body and their brain and their heart, like nothing's connected, right?
Yeah.
They're just swirling. Do you feel like any kind of somatic work and also what you do is a piece to the puzzle to kind of realigning society?
Oh, to society. Yeah. I mean, I think
Everybody did work like this. Would we be more realigned?
if everybody did cinesomatics, this fucking world would look very different. I mean, one of my visions is working with, world leaders. And if you could just imagine people that have done my process and work, and I say, if you could just, because there's group work too. If you could imagine, 5 world leaders getting in the room and discovering and revealing their own and each other's manipulations, lies, distortions, needs, agendas, light, shadow, and there was this healing and intimacy. I mean, yeah.
The whole world would be fixed.
Well, I want to say fixed, but certainly there would be a lot of change, because if you look in the world, there's not a lot of intimacy and honesty between politicians or countries. And we certainly need boundaries. There's certainly people that you have to learn that either they're trustable or not. But that also doesn't mean that there's people that, everybody's a blanket statement. And then if we live in fear. I think that with my work in particular, it could really be world changing. With somatic stuff in general, because mine's different. So the somatic part is really just one piece of it. So anything that gets people out of their head and into their body is going to be helpful. It may create some chaos and, intensity in the short term, because after decades of being in your head and not in your body, when you go down here and start feeling, you're going to start feeling all the stuff that you've spent decades not wanting to feel and suppress. Yeah. So in the short term, there tends to be chaos. It tends to feel worse. But in the long term, as that person integrates and faces those things, life only improves. I've never met or had any client that genuinely was more in their body and less in their head, that in all areas of life didn't improve.
Interesting. So work-life balance, life, friendships, family, all of it.
Finances, sensuality, digestion. I mean, everything changes. Yeah.
Wow.
So hug your dictator, everyone. And then tell people how they can find you if they want to do work with you.
AndrewDaniel.org. If any of this stuff is interesting, I do really recommend getting the book, Awaken to Your True Self, before booking a session or anything, because this really, it really sets the foundation, and I really define things, but it's also very confronting. And so by reading my book, you'll get a really good taste if I'm your cup of tea or not.
Yeah. We'll link down below. I was going to link to the Daniel.org, Cinesomatics, and your YouTube channel and the book.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Do we cover
find all that stuff below? Subscribe, do all the links.
Hit the like button.
Andrew,
click that notification bell.
Yes, do all the things, whatever, all the stuffs. Andrew, thank you so much for spending time with us and talking about your work and really going off on all these wild tangents with us.
Yeah, I didn't think this was the conversation we're going to have, but thank you so much for the great questions. I'm glad I don't get to go into in the beginning of the myths of cultures to the world changing of sex. So
that was my
really
favorite part. You're good at that. That was fun.
In the beginning.
In the beginning.
Is there anything that we missed that you wanted to talk about? Because we did steer you in different directions.
Oh,
Anything we missed?
No, I really think that conversations around intimacy and masculine and femininity are really important. And I think really just a willingness to go into ourselves, not being a victim, not blaming other people, of realizing that no matter where you go, there you are. If this is happening with all these people, you're a common denominator, and it doesn't mean it's your fault or you're to blame, but it does mean that it's up to you to change, to make a new choice. And so a willingness to be vulnerable, a willingness to face our judgments of ourselves, others, our shadow material, the masculine and feminine archetypes, and an earnest desire to meet our partner's needs. I think these are all great things that anyone can practically start applying.
Beautiful. Sorry, my neighbor, ironically, was just talking about her needs to somebody.
So well said. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everybody check out andrewdaniel.org. Be well, stay connected, everyone. Big love to all. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody. Bye.